Derwent makes watercolors? As some of you may know, I'm an art supply fiend, and I have a really hard time resisting buying new art supplies, especially when I find out about something new that I didn't know about before. And as many of us know, Derwent has been putting out some paint pan sets for quite a while now in their most popular lines. We're probably most familiar with the Inktense paint pans, and they have the Graphitin paint pans, and I think they have a couple others as well. But did you know that they have some that are just specifically watercolors? Because I didn't know until just recently. And of course, when I found out, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna have to try them. Hi, my name is Shanna Rowe Jackson, also known as Caution Artist at Play, because I love to play with all different sorts of art supplies. And that's what we're gonna do today. I have the 24 set of the Derwent Watercolor Pans. And because I am such an avid user of the Derwent Inktense line, I am actually going to put these up against my 12 set of the Inktense paint pans, because I want to know, like, are they better than the Inktense? Are they about the same? Is it pretty much the same product but remarketed? I mean, I'm just really curious to see how they hold up next to one another and how different they are, and if there's really even a reason to have the watercolors. All right, so I'm going to jump in the sketchbook. I'm also going to do some swatching, and we're going to see how these stack up. So let's get to it. Okay, so I have here their Derwent watercolor pencils. I'm going to swatch these as well because Lord help me if these paints aren't better than their watercolor pencils. Then I also have the Inktense Paint Pan Travel Set number 1. This is their 12 set. And most of you probably know what Derwent Inktense are. They are a water-soluble medium by Derwent that have an ink-like consistency. I describe it that way because in their frequently asked questions, somebody asked if these were actually ink-based or watercolor-based. And their answer is they are classified as a watercolor product, but have a different formulation that gives them an ink-like consistency. And so I'll pop that up there, but just so you know. So these are known to be more permanent and more vibrant than regular watercolor. And here you can see what this palette looks like. And this is just the 12 set with the sun yellow, the mango, poppy red, dark plum, mid ultramarine, bright blue, teal green, racing green, kiwi, burnt yellow ochre, natural brown, and ink black. You can see it has a fun little swatch card that comes with it, just to give you an idea of what is in that set. Now, the Derwent watercolor paint pan set is supposed to be formulated to be ultra smooth finish and developed for consistency. So I think they're supposed to differ a little bit from the Derwent Inktense. And this is the color lineup for this set. This is the 24 set. It's lemon cad, deep cadmium, mango orange, poppy red, madder carmine, magenta, dark violet, amethyst, ultramarine, spectrum blue, kingfisher blue, jade green, bottle green, emerald green, grass green, olive green, raw sienna, copper beech, terracotta, chocolate, Payne's gray, ivory black, and Chinese white. Now, this did not come with its own fun little swatch the way the Inktense did. This thing on the back, it's supposed to be cut out. That serves as their swatch card for this set. So that's one difference. And as you can tell, neither set lists the light fast ratings directly on the set itself or the pigment information. The light fast ratings can be found on their color charts. So taking a quick look at each of their color charts, you can see that each line offers up to 24 pans. They both do offer open stock pans as well in case you want to replace colors. Now, as of right now, while I'm recording, I cannot find the watercolor paint pan set in stores in the US. They haven't appeared at Blick yet or Jerry's, at least as far as I have seen. But I bought my set from Cult Pens online and I was able to have it shipped here, and they offered the pans open stock. They offer a 12 set and a 24 set of the watercolors. And the Derwent Inktense sets of pans, they offer 2 different sets of 12, I believe, and a 24 set, as well as replacement pans open stock, and they are readily available here in the US. Now, looking at their light fast ratings, they all seem to be between a 7 and an 8 on the Blue Wool scale, with a couple of exceptions in each line. The cherry and the Inktense paint pan set looks like is only a 4. The fuchsia is only a 6. And then it looks like in the watercolor paint pan line, the amethyst is a 5. And the rest of the set seems to be between a 7 and an 8 on the blue wool scale. Again, this is keeping in mind that Derwent has been open about the fact that they don't test their colors after they have been washed out with water. So they're basically going on the information that they have about the pigments that they use. And again, we don't have access to the pigments that are used in these, at least not according to their color chart. So we kind of have to take their word for it and err on the side of caution when we are working with water-soluble media from a lot of different companies. It's not just a Derwent thing. It happens a lot with different companies. But, you know, just keep in mind we don't have the pigment information on either of these. It's great that they are made with pigments instead of dyes, because then you have more of a chance of having a light, fast product. Anytime you add any amount of water to a pigment, even if it's a light, fast pigment, it's going to be more prone to fading than it was when it was dry. So it's just the nature of a water-soluble product. Now, let's look at this watercolor pan set. Just offhand, they look very similar to the Derwent Inktense pans, and let's just look at them right next to each other. You may have noticed while I was listing the color names in each set that some of these colors have the same name as each other. And then there's some like these greens that have different names but look exactly alike. And then you have poppy red that is the same. Mango is another color that is in both sets. The brown looks really similar, but it has a different name. They each come with an empty water brush, and the Inktense comes with a sponge, but the watercolor does not. A closer look at that. Very matte. Both of them are very, very matte when dry. Now let's take a look at my swatch card. I am going to start off by swatching the Derwent watercolor pencils, and this is probably the oldest of the 3. As far as how long they've been on the market. I didn't have a purple in this line, so I put not applicable there, but I did try to choose colors from the 3 different lines that kind of coincide with one another. I tried to get as close as I could. It's tough when I have that 24 set and a 12 set, and then I don't have all my pencils anymore because I got rid of the ones that were fugitive. And now I'm doing the Inktense because this is the one I am most familiar with. As you can see, very vibrant, washes out very well in water. So that's kind of our comparison right there. You can already see that the Inktense are way more vibrant than the Derwent watercolor pencils. Let's see how the Derwent watercolor pans compare. So far, they are very vibrant and beautiful. They look pretty similar to the Derwent Inktense when you first start to lay them down, though they do tend to dry a little bit lighter, I noticed, once the swatches dry. And maybe a little bit more transparent. Especially that black. And then I also put amethyst in there because it was kind of closer to the dark plum. Now I'm coming down in these leaves and I'm adding water to the paper first, and then I am dipping the pigment in there to see how they do wet and wet. And it looked like the Inktense initially carried a lot further in the water than these watercolors. The watercolor pencils really just don't hold up their end of the bargain, but I didn't expect them to. So a few notes. The Inktense were really vibrant. They spread really far with water. And then the Derwent watercolor pans dried less vibrant or less saturated, I guess, than the Inktense. A little bit lighter than the Inktense. And it kind of felt like they might have some pretty good control in the water, at least with just these preliminary swatches. But I'm going to jump to my sketchbook, and I am going to do 2 different pieces where I will be comparing the Derwent Inktense right next to the Derwent watercolor pans. Because swatches can really only tell us so much, and I will not be using the Derwent watercolor pencils with the rest of it. I am very excited that these are more pigmented than the Derwent watercolor pencils. Okay, so on to my piece. Each side of the sketchbook is going to have a poppy in it. And I'm not going to be ultra detailed and realistic about these pieces because I'm kind of on a time crunch. I just want to get a feel for these paints. Now, right off the bat, you can see that the left side has Inktense and the right side has the watercolors. You can already see that the watercolors are way more watery, which is not a bad thing. And this is exactly why I like to do an actual piece instead of just swatching, because with the initial swatches, it was looking like the Derwent Inktense was going to go further in water, but these watercolors actually go pretty far without a whole lot of water. And I'm working wet into dry right now, and they're still going pretty far. I was able to get the background of that one done a lot faster because they stayed wet a lot longer. With Inktense, they tend to dry out a little bit faster. You have to re-wet the pans or the blocks a little bit more often because I use the blocks a lot as well. Inktense has the pencils, the blocks, and the pans. Now, I tend to use my blocks a lot like watercolors, and so the pans are a little redundant in my collection. However, it is nice to have them on hand for travel, and I have noticed I have to re-wet them way more often. So I was really excited when I got to the watercolor part of this and I didn't have to keep re-wetting. They went a lot further in water because they weren't drying out on the paper as fast either. So these watercolors react really well to water compared to the Inktense pans. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm in love with Inktense. You're not going to catch me throwing shade at Inktense because it's one of my favorite mediums. I'm always working with Inktense. But it's just something to observe. If you're somebody who likes to do a looser watercolor style, you might benefit from trying out these Derwent watercolors, especially if you are a fan of Derwent in general. Now, when they dry though, that's where I was kind of like, oh, these are pretty similar. They both dry to a really matte finish. It's a little bit, I don't know, like not chalky. They're not chalky, but the Inktense especially are almost gouache-like. I feel like that's kind of the best comparison I can give when working on both of these pieces so close to each other. And to be fair, I did the Inktense one first, and then I came over and did the watercolor one after. And so the Derwent Inktense one, I might have been a little bit slower on just because of the fact that I was trying to kind of figure out how I wanted to approach these pieces. And then by the time I came to the watercolor side, I already kind of had a blueprint because of my Inktense side. And so I worked a little bit faster on that one. But I was able to lay that background in really, really fast. But you can kind of see the difference already because the watercolors blend a little bit more easily because they're so washed out. They have a little bit more of that transparent look, whereas the Inktense definitely have more of that gouache look. So that's my best comparison. It's like using gouache pans compared to using regular watercolor pans, which I found to be really exciting. One reason why I'm doing this comparison is I was like, do I really need to have these? Does anybody really need to have these watercolors? If they already have the Inktense pans, what the heck is the point, right? And so that's why I'm doing this comparison for myself and to help others decide if this is something that they want to add to their collection. And Derwent, as I mentioned, has come out with other pans in the past as well. They have the Derwent Graphitint pans. I have found that those are a little bit, they're not as vibrant as the pencils, so they differ a little bit from the pencils. I do feel like the Inktense pans, they're maybe a little bit different than the pencils because the pencils tend to be very vibrant, but the pans feel very similar to me to the Derwent Inktense blocks. But I didn't have a pencil really to compare this to other than the Derwent watercolor pencils. And now that I've been working with water-soluble pencils a lot more in recent months, I am discovering that the Derwent watercolor pencils, they just don't hold up pigment-wise. And so I'm definitely relieved to see that these Derwent watercolor pans are much more vibrant and just much stronger of a product than the Derwent watercolor pencils. Maybe they'll reformulate their pencils after this. They don't need to touch the Inktense. The Inktense are fine. The Inktense are just fine where they are. But maybe at some point, now that they've come out with this formulation for their watercolor pans, maybe they'll reformulate their watercolor pencils a little bit so that they're closer to the pans. That's my hope, but I don't know if Derwent's listening or not, but hint. Also, if it's not obvious already, this video was not sponsored by Derwent. I bought these on my own, out of my own curiosity. So as you can see, I have kind of just gone through and laid in the backgrounds. I tried to grab colors that were really similar, though the Inktense side of things, the background ended up being a lot cooler than the watercolor side, but I think it was a pretty good comparison. I did go through and lift out some spots to create a bokeh effect. It was much easier to lift out the side on the watercolor side than it was on the Inktense side, which is to be expected because Derwent Inktense is supposed to be more permanent than regular watercolors. You're not supposed to be able to lift them as easily once they're watered down. To be fair, you can still lift them. Like, they're not as permanent as they like to make them out to be. Speaking as somebody who has a lot of experience with them. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because I like to be able to correct things. And so I was still able to lift out a moderately bokeh-ish background in my Inktense one, but it was definitely quicker and easier on the watercolor side. So these lift more easily than the Inktense. And in the flowers is where you're really going to start to see a difference here. That pigment just spurs right out way more on the watercolor side. You're getting more of that fun painterly watercolor effect in those petals than on the Inktense side. So Inktense so far is giving a little bit more control. Initially in my swatches, it felt like the watercolor was going to spur out less than the Inktense, but in practice, in this piece, it does not take much for that watercolor side to really spread. No, I'm not saying that this is going to be the most beautiful spreading watercolor that you're going to get out there. It's not going to be the highest end color that you'll get out there, but it's definitely more watery and wishy-washy than the Inktense. So again, if you are a painterly painter, you might be more interested in trying the watercolors than the Inktense. Or if you find the Inktense aren't giving you the wishy-washy look that you want, like if you already have the Inktense, then you might want to try these. Now, finished looks, again, they dry very similarly. The watercolor side seems to dry a little less vibrantly, a little bit lighter. Any water-soluble product that you use is probably going to dry lighter as it is. Inktense dries lighter than it looks when it's still wet, and it's just how it is. But it does tend to keep its vibrancy maybe a little bit more. Now, Inktense are supposed to be intense. That's why they're called that. They're supposed to look like ink, and they're supposed to be intense. And so I'm not too upset about the fact that the watercolor might be a little bit more subtle. It might take a little bit more layering to get the same saturation that you would get with an Inktense. Again, it's just really a matter of personal taste and how you like to work. Now let's talk a little bit more about layering as well. I was worried that because the watercolors lift more easily, and I expected them to lift more easily, that it would be difficult to layer. Now, is it easier to layer with the Inktense? Probably, because again, they're not going to lift as easily underneath. But you can still build up some pretty fun transparent layers with these watercolors as well. And I had to do that in the background because even though the background worked up faster because it spread further and it stayed wet longer, it didn't have the vibrancy that I necessarily wanted. There was, it was transparent. There was some of the paper was still showing through more than I would have liked. So I did have to come through in that background and layer again until I got the saturation that I liked. That being said, I didn't have to do as many layers of the Inktense. Both can be layered transparently, though. I was able to get more layers in with the watercolor. It didn't lift too horribly. I was very gentle with my brush when going over the layers beneath. And I was able to build up that saturation that I wanted to. So if that's something that you're worried about when you're thinking about, this versus Inktense, it can still be done. You can still layer until you get the saturation that you desire. Now, I didn't want to layer it up totally and completely. I wanted to keep some of that freshness in the look of, the watercolor piece. Because again, Inktense really, once you start hammering down on the layers, can feel a lot like gouache in its finished form. When you look at it finished, it's got this matte look to it. It can feel a lot like gouache. And so I wanted to leave some of that wishy-washy look of watercolor, that transparency, that freshness. And so I didn't go too crazy in layering in certain areas, especially in the flowers. I really loved how the petals came out in the pink poppies. Now, I am doing 2 different colored poppies because I wanted to differentiate them a little bit, and I'm working from 2 different references. I took the reference photos when I went to the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, and me and Angela Clark from Clark Fine Art, we went down there for the plein air days and went and painted, and we also got a whole crap ton of reference photos. And these poppies, there were poppies everywhere. We also met up with Lindsay, the Frugal Crafter, and Karen, and we just had such a great time. And so I really wanted to work from these references because I wanted to keep reliving that day. Now, because I'm in my sketchbook, I want to be playful and fun. And so I'm bringing in some of the Micron pens. I have a brush pen here and I think a 0.3 to kind of add some definition and bring both of these pieces together more. And I was feeling kind of illustrative that day. I had just finished the recent piece that I did using the Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle of some daffodils. That was a really detailed, time-consuming piece. I needed a break. I needed a break. I needed to just have fun. But also, when I'm trying a new medium, I really like to see how it works in a mixed media way as well. So I thought that this would be a good opportunity to see how well you could layer pens over these watercolors. I'm used to doing it with Inktense already, so I knew that that would be just fine. But I wanted to see how the watercolors held up, and they did really well. I didn't end up with a lot of the pigment on the nibs of my pen or anything like that. It wasn't like drying out my pen by covering it with too much pigment. It worked really well. And I had fun with the brush pen. I really wanted these organic kind of broken lines where the line width varies depending on how much pressure you put with the brush. I really like that natural line look. And so I had a lot of fun with that. I thought it went well with the floral. And I think it brought the piece together. I'm really, really happy with the sketchbook spread. All in all, I do think that this is a pretty fun product. I was really impressed with how different they were. I mean, they're not completely different from the Inktense, especially if you're used to using the Inktense. I think that this wouldn't be a hard transition for you. But the biggest difference for me, again, was the flow to it. The fact that they stayed wet longer, you didn't have to re-wet your pans as often, and it stayed wet longer on the paper, and it just made it easier to blend and gave that nice, beautiful, flowy watercolor feel. Though once they're dry, they do kind of look a lot alike. Different in working, not so much in finished product. Okay, so here's my final sketchbook spread. I just love these 2 little pieces together. As you can tell, the finished pieces look very similar. So some of my final thoughts on the watercolor paint pan set compared with the Inktense paint pan set. Looks-wise, the finished results are very, very similar. You might be able to see a little bit more transparency in the petals on the side where I use the watercolor, but other than that, they both have that kind of matte look and just very, very similar as a finished product. The main differences I noticed was really in the working properties of these paints and mainly in the fact that the watercolor paint pans re-wet a lot more easily. And they seem to stay wet longer than the Inktense does. And it makes it a little bit more easily to get smoother blends in larger areas. They're a little bit more transparent, so you have to layer them a little bit more to get the vibrancy that you get with the Inktense. When all of that is said and done, you can get a product that looks almost exactly the same. So what does that mean? If you are somebody who has the Inktense travel set already and you're really happy with the Inktense paint pans, I don't necessarily think you need to run out and buy these, but if you are someone who wants something to be a little bit more watery and a little bit more wishy-washy, then you might be curious enough to get these. I think that both are great products. Very subtle difference though, mainly in working. That is my assessment in using these for the first time. I will be using them more. I am curious to stack them up against other watercolors that are in the same price range. I wouldn't consider them to be an artist grade watercolor set. I mean, it's not going to be like a Daniel Smith, right? But I could probably compare them with a watercolor set in a similar, price range just to see how it throws down. Maybe some of the Zen Art watercolors or something like that, just to see how those compare. If that's something that you would like to see, let me know or give me suggestions suggestions in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed this comparison video. I really do enjoy working with the watercolors. I had a lot of fun with them. Again, I don't know. If you are already in love with the Inktense and you like the way they work, you may not need them. If you want to be a little bit more flowy, maybe you'll want to try the watercolors. Let me know in the comments below if you have tried these watercolors yet, and let me know which painting you like the best, because I had a lot of fun with both. I will see you next week. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more like it, check this one out. You have a fantastic day. Bye.